My name is Anita Hoge, and this is my testimony of how I filed a federal complaint against the Pennsylvania Department of Education. The name of the test was the Pennsylvania EQA, Educational Quality Assessment. And this test was measuring the attitudes, values, and opinions of our children. So I am a witness that will actually show you that one person can make a difference. So my son was in the 8th grade actually. He came home from school one day and he said, "Mom, I had just taken a test that was really weird. I didn't know how to answer the questions. There really wasn't a right answer." So, of course, as a parent, you say, what was on the test? What was going on? And he said, they brought the whole entire class down for an assembly in the gym, and the principal had said, "This is a test that the state gives, and please answer honestly." And the sample question that he used in the assembly was, if you saw an old lady standing on the side of the street, what would you do? A, push her in the street, B, throw rocks at her, etc. Well, I became very much alarmed. I happened to be writing a grant for the school district at the time for the Artist in Education program. So I was working very closely with the superintendent. So I went to the superintendent and I asked about the test and I asked to see it. And she picked up a book and threw it across the room and said, "You and I aren't going to be friends anymore." And of course that was where my journey began, because I was determined to see the test, to see what was going on, why the state was collecting all this information, and then what they were doing with the data. So this was basically how my journey began. And it's a story that I think all parents have to realize, that our children come home sometimes and tell us things, and sometimes we aren't listening, and we should be listening a little closer, because children do know that there are some things that are wrong going on in the schools. So what I did at that time was, it was my basic research to find out what and how and everything about what the test was. So I'd gone to the school board, and I had also requested from them in writing to see the test, but other things started to come up of different things that were happening in the school. And my son came home again, and it was interesting because he wrote the activity and the questions that he was being asked in school on his arm. And he came home and he said that they were having this magic circle, and they actually called it effective ed, and he kept calling it defective ed. And this was when they had them in a circle and they had to discuss who they were going to throw out of the bomb shelter. They showed them a film about environmental, and they had big tractors with American on them. And the very last comment on the film, which there were no words, it was always tractors going around burning up baby ducks, and the whole environmentalist concept. And the last quote was, "Man cannot foresee or forestall, he will end by destroying the earth." And then the activity was a magic circle where they were given a list of people who were going to populate the new world that they were going to try, because the man had destroyed the earth. And of course there were things like, you had the scientist and the biologist and all the important people, and then they had the beautician and the preacher, and they had to select 4 of the 8 or 9 people that they were going to populate. I was furious, absolutely furious. So I had gone in and asked to see the film, and they said they had to bring it in, and of course I made them bring it in, saw the film. But these were the activities that our kids were telling us, my son was telling me about, but yet, we still couldn't figure out why they were there. Why was this going on? So then, of course, I went to my local legislators, requested the test. Interestingly, about 6 or 7 months later, probably even a little more, as I continued to write to the state requesting to see the test, which I was denied access again and again and again, there was a legislative aide who, when I called in, had sent me a lot of information on the Pennsylvania EQA. So this is when I found out that I could actually order documents from their computer system, and then began, just from at home, requesting all this information, and then I would get all of the documents based on the EQA. At that time, I was able to locate the actual tests, how they score the tests, and then what was done with the information. So this is really what I want to explain to you, because this will give you an idea of why the government is collecting the information and what they're doing with the information, and why everything that's happening now is very similar, if not exactly the same, of what happened to me during that period of time. So taken exactly from the Pennsylvania EQA documents of explaining how they were about to do this, and this is a direct quote, "A word about attitudes. Attitudes, beliefs, and values are abstractions. Nevertheless, they are real enough to each individual holding them. They are typically thought of a state of readiness, a predisposition to act or react in a certain way when faced with certain situations. A person's attitudes are always present, but remain dormant most of the time. They are expressed in speech or in behavior only when the object of the attitude is perceived. A person may have strong attitudes for or against astrology, but actively express them only when some issue connected with astrology arises, or when confronted by an attitude scale. Attitudes are often reinforced by beliefs, the cognitive, and attract strong feelings, the emotional component, that will lead to a particular behavior, the action tendency. The measurement of attitudes always involves making inferences about, since the attitudes cannot be seen or measured directly, we must infer their presence from consistencies that appear in the individual's behavior. Observing individuals across time and everyday situations is probably the best way to learn how the individuals think, feel, and act." This is the whole child theory. The whole child theory is the cognitive, directly relates to the affective, directly relates to the psychomotor, how a person thinks, feels, and acts. You cannot change someone's behavior unless you create a conflict in what they believe, what they feel, in order to control behavior. So the whole concept of the Pennsylvania EQA was that they were going to test the attitudes so that they were able to control how a child will act or determine how they will act in the future. And this was very important. So this is Bloom's taxonomy. It was very much a point when Benjamin Bloom, of course, wrote the Taxonomy of Educational Objectives, and David Crathwell wrote the Taxonomy of Educational Objectives in the Affective Domain. So this is the background of what the government was looking for. And understand that cognitive, most people think cognitive is about academics. Cognitive is your belief system. It's what you believe is true. So yes, you can teach a child 2 + 2 is 4. That is cognitive. But it's your belief system. So yes, Lincoln was the 14th President of the United States, but it's also, do you believe in God? Do you believe that Aunt Mary made the best apple pie in the world? That is your belief system. And that is directly related to how you feel about that. How do you feel? What is your attitude about that? What is your value? So in order to control behavior and to change behavior, you have to create a conflict in the belief system and in your attitudes and values. In order to do this, the government had to collect information, data on the individual student. And this is where the EQA comes in. So, as we continue, when I saw the very first Pennsylvania EQA, it had over 300 questions on attitudes, values, beliefs. 20 questions in reading, 20 questions in math. The whole idea is that this had nothing to do with academics. What I found was that when I got these, they were called Resources for Improvement. So the first thing that I received was called Getting Inside the EQA Inventory. This was a government document that was printed by the Pennsylvania Department of Education. But what I found was that Pennsylvania appeared to have a larger story behind it. There was a lot more going on. And as I continued to research and pull up documents and send for these documents from, they called it the RISE, it was the National Diffusion Network. And I couldn't really figure out at the time the connection of why the Pennsylvania EQA was so much involved with all of this national validating criteria. So this was a time when, and I called it the tempest in the test, the Pennsylvania EQA. But what I found, it was the model test for measuring the attitudes and values for actually world citizenship. The top behavioral scientists in the world were in Pennsylvania in 1965 formulating the Pennsylvania EQA. And what I found was that the Pennsylvania EQA was actually the model for the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. The standing committee included Yuri Brenner from Cornell, Warren Findley, the University of Georgia, Joshua Fishman, Yeshiva University, Eric Gardner, Syracuse University, David Krathwalls, Michigan State University, Robert Thorndike, Columbia University, Melvin Tooman, Princeton, Ralph Tyler, Palo Alto, UCLA, along with a contract with Educational Testing Service. And ESA, Elementary and Secondary Education Act, was the federal funding that secretly moved the agenda along. So, getting inside the EQA inventory was a real eye-opener. So I'm going to take you through one of the goals, although it started out with 10 quality goals of education, which were taken from the NEA's 1913 Cardinal Principles of Education. So remember in the beginning when we talked about attitudes were parts of a tendency to act in a certain way, dispositions. And I want you to remember that word throughout this presentation, because what they are doing right now is exactly what they did in testing dispositions during that period of time when my son took the test. Pennsylvania goal, citizenship. Quality education should help every child acquire the habits and attitudes associated with responsible citizenship. We can all agree to that idea, of course, but what you as an American may have thought was being measured was really totally the opposite. The information that I'm going to tell you is very scientific, a little bit complicated, but very important. And I'm hoping that you'll bear with me while I try to explain what B.F. Skinner was looking for and all the social engineers that I had just explained to you that were involved in the NAEP and the Pennsylvania EQA went about measuring our children's attitudes and values. I do have the test, I do have the scoring materials. So this is an exact quote from the Pennsylvania EQA. The National Assessment of Educational Progress developed 9 citizenship objectives. These national objectives were used to provide a frame of reference for what was to be measured. Objectives in the factual domain, knowing structure of government or understanding problems of international relations, were not considered in developing the scale. Arriving at a satisfactory definition of